Bon dia, buenos días, good morning everyone.
En anglès, no?
Jo faré una mica barrejat, tu com vulguis que me't sentis. Benvinguts tots a aquest tercer congrés, tercera conferència internacional de revistes acadèmiques en comunicació. Aquesta és la tercera vegada que fem aquest congrés. La primera vegada el vam fer l'any 2015, la segona el 2017, el 2019. Així és la tercera edició. La idea d'aquest congrés és portar de diversos llocs internacionals i nacionals editors de revistes en comunicació per parlar de quins temes estan ara influint en aquest sector i quines són una mica les perspectives de futur. Avui tenim un programa molt interessant que hem volgut relacionar amb el Dia Internacional de la Dona i per això hem convidat tres editores de revistes que estan relacionades amb la comunicació, però més en un sentit més ampli a estudis de gènere. We want to welcome our keynote speakers and thank them very much for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome them in here. També volia agrair la presència del vicerector de recerca de la Universitat Pompeu Fabra, el professor Enric Valldoví, que tinc a la meva esquerra, excusar l'absència de la vicerectora Mònica Figueres, que és l'encarregada a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra de responsabilitat social i també tots els temes de gènere, tot i que tindrem una opening lecture de la professora Tània Verge en aquest sentit, i donar-vos a tots la benvinguda. Espero que us serveixi, que us agradi, que puguem debatre al llarg de tot aquest matí i tota aquesta tarda, i sense més cedeixo la paraula al professor Enric Valldoví. Moltes gràcies.
Moltes gràcies, Josep. Bon dia, buenos días, good morning. Faré el gruix de la meva intervenció en anglès perquè com que he rebut un programa que era majoritàriament en anglès, em pensava que ho havia de fer en anglès i per això ho faré en anglès. Voy a hablar mayoritariamente en inglés porque iba con esta expectativa, pero iré mezclando. Esto me pasa a veces. First of all, welcome to UPF, welcome to Barcelona, for those of you who come from outside of the city, on behalf of the rector, Jaume Casals, and on my own behalf, of course. And it's a pleasure to be here doing this very, if you want, ornamental job, but not for that less sincere. I'm really happy to do this. I did this last year. It was nice to do it too. And it's particularly nice. I'm a linguist. I work on this campus, so this is my home, not only the university, but the campus. But also because as Vice Director for Research, I deal not only with, we have a research office, which is very good, and I deal with them, with these professionals every week, but regularly I meet with the librarians and with the IT people that take care of the way in which we publish, in which we disseminate our research. And I believe that is a substantial component of the research activity of any institution, like a university. I believe that not only in sort of like doing what we can to help our researchers publish in whatever they deem is the best alternative. They are very good at that, so they don't need a lot of advice in that respect, just help to get it done, but also in making available to them other resources like our e-repository for publications and for data and other products. It's a very hectic, very, I was going to say dramatic, but it's not dramatic. It's a very active time in terms of research publication these days, with Plan S at the level of Europe, with open science, open access, knocking at the door of every single researcher in Europe and the world these days. So it's an issue that takes up a lot of time of our professionals here, librarians, IT people, researchers, and they do quite good. Our university is not at all bad in that respect. We get our positions in the rankings are not bad, and a good part of that is because we're good at disseminating our research. So I think this type of workshops, this type of meetings, conferences are very important, and that's why I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm also happy to be here because of this special emphasis on gender studies, on the publication of gender studies this year, and I'm going to be happy to listen to Tania, who's a colleague of mine in the executive board of the university. Talk about that. We have a center for gender studies, which is in charge of making sure that what's done across the university is known through the rest of the departments and outside of UPF. So doing research is important. Making it known that the research is done is almost or as important as doing the research. So thank you for being here. I hope you have a great day. Enjoy the workshop. Okay? Cheers.
Thank you very much, Enric. And just to finish these opening words, I will give the floor to our Deputy Director for Research in the Department of Communication, Professor Frederic Guerrero.
Thank you, Josep. Thank you, Enric. Bé, primer de tot, bon dia a tothom i moltes gràcies per venir a la tercera Conferència Internacional de Revistes Acadèmiques en Comunicació. Com a responsable que soc de recerca del Departament, em sento particularment satisfet de poder tenir avui els ponents que tenim, editors i editores de revistes de gènere molt rellevants dins de la comunitat acadèmica i també els participants de la sessió de la tarda de la FECIT, UNIR o CSIC, entre d'altres. Como ya sabréis, hago un poco de presentación de la conferencia para un poco explicar cuáles son las tres partes que la componen. La primera parte de esta mañana se va a dedicar particularmente a la intersección entre las disciplinas de la comunicación y los estudios de género, con una primera ponencia que abrirá nuestra colega Tania Verge, a quien agradezco particularmente haber aceptado participar en esta conferencia. Luego vendrán tres intervenciones más de tres editoras que os presentaré posteriormente y una mesa redonda que va a ser coordinada por mis colegas Pilar Medina y Lorena Gómez. Posteriormente cerraremos esta primera sesión y intervendrán Celia William y Stuart Allan para dar una visión un poco más. Celia, la intervención de Celia será como un enlace entre la anterior y una visión más general sobre el que es el proceso de publicación en revistas académicas, y Stuart hablará particularmente de su revista, de la revista de la que es editor, que es Education Journalism. Haremos un break posteriormente y por la tarde habrá la sesión nacional, que estará compuesta por Pilar Rico, Rafael Repiso y Reme Melero, y luego posteriormente haremos una tabla redonda con nuestro colega también Carlos Colari, a quien aprovecho para agradecer su participación. Espero que no me deje a nadie. I would like to thank our guests for participating in this event. Thank you very much. For some of them, it's been a long trip, yeah, and in a short time. So thanks for being here. And I'm sure that we will enjoy and we'll learn a lot of things from your presentations about the processes of publication and the challenges for authors, editors, reviewers in, as Enric Baldoví said, in a highly competitive context in which research and publication is guaranteed, let's say that way, of our academic careers. I would like to thank the efforts. Krista came from the United States, Cindy Carter, Stuart Allan, and Sarah Riley, and also Celia Willem from Tarragona that will be here in short. So I hope that all of you will enjoy the conference and spend a great time here at the campus Poblenou. And now my colleague Tania Verge will start the first presentation with a short lecture entitled Feminist Research as Good as Science, Challenging the Gendered Boundaries of the Discipline. Tania Verge is an associate professor at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. She's the director of the Equality Unit in this university and has published extensively in the fields of gender and political representation, including women's symbolic representation and gendered mediation. So I think that this is my short introduction. Tania, it's your turn. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thanks, Enric. Thanks, Josep.
Thank you.
Jo em quedaré amb la Tània, si vols pots.
Good morning. I really appreciate your having me here. I'm a political scientist, as Frederick explained, a feminist political science though, and I will also be speaking in my capacity as the director of the Equality Unit. The UPF has a gender action plan and mainstreaming gender in research, as well as teaching and all other areas of university policies is one of the key areas. I would like to start my presentation by addressing the why gender question from two different perspectives. Why gender, meaning why should we include gender, or why should we mainstream gender in our research? And the first type of why gender question deals with the mandate, the European mandate to include gender in research projects. And this is a question that I quite often still get. I'm still asked, why? Where is it? Where is this all information, right? Well, if you just open the Horizon 2020 website, the European Research Area website, you do find all the information on why gender is one of the key dimensions of the research, responsible research innovation, and how it should be mainstream in the different phases of the research project. Not only I'm often asked, why should we include that? But also, is that new? I didn't know it. Maybe, you have not explained us how it came to be. Well, it already has about 20-year track record, at least within the European Union. I'm not going to go through that, just look at the first year, right, 1998, the first discussions on how science had a different impact on women, and the Women in Science group was established. The European Union has put also emphasis on the gender gap in terms of the composition of research groups, but also the gendered dimensions of institutions. So it's not about fixing women, but it's about fixing institutions, right? Rethinking how institutions, research institutions, funding agencies, etc. operate that end up potentially discriminating against women. And in this regard, as regards the composition of academia, this is one of the most known figures worldwide, right? The so-called scissors graph, in which we can compare, which is the amount of male and female students at the bachelor level, and how the gender gap increases throughout the academic ladder. The last position, grade A, being the full professorship position. This is a static picture, so you might think, well, okay, it's not taking into account that women have gradually incorporated in academia, not just as students, but also as professors. But even if it's a static picture, we know that women overcame men in terms of access to university about 20 years ago. And we haven't seen this leveling of the composition of men and women throughout the academic position. So nowadays, this is the average of the European Union for the last She Figures report published in 2018. 76% of full professors are men. And if we compare it with the 10-year picture, we see that, yeah, there's been some increase, but it's the increase rate is rather glacial. It's very, very slow. So I'm sorry to break the news, but if we keep on with this increase rate, many of you in this room, maybe including me, will not see the full equiparation of men and women at all positions of the academic career. So if it follows up this increase, it might take between 30 and 40 years to reach parity. So it remains an elusive goal. Yet, when the European Union talks about the gender dimension of research, the composition of research teams, as well as the gender culture of institutions, it's just one aspect of it. It's just one dimension. It has to do with the equal opportunities for men and women in research. The second dimension, which I think is key, and it has to do a lot with the content of the presentations you'll have today, is how to include, or why is gender relevant in terms of research content. And here I want to emphasize as well, because I think there's this misunderstanding, or this is a misunderstanding I come across quite oftenly, which is the promotion of gender in research content, as it has been established by the European Union, on the one hand, has to do with promoting gender studies. And this promotion has to do with the fact that gender studies are filling the gaps, are filling critical omissions of the mainstream literature that have left women not just much less research, but in some cases virtually unknowable. We don't know much about women in many different domains, but also, on the other hand, it has to do with mainstreaming gender in all research, or at least developing the capacity to assess whether gender might be relevant for your research, regardless of the topic you are examining. So now I move to the second why question, which I think is more relevant, or at least I think it's more useful to understand why gender is relevant, and it has to do with the second aspect I just discussed. The inclusion of gender in research builds on the need to change the patterns of exclusion that science has produced. So there are several knowledge practices that have historically discriminated against women and still keep discriminating women. We can start by emphasizing how women have historically been denied epistemic authority. And when I say historically, I'm talking about a historical trend. It's still an ongoing trend. If you want to check it, just count the number of women and men you have on your syllabus. Just count the number of men and women you are quoting in your research. And you will see that there is a significant imbalance. This gender citation gap has been proved to be quite pervasive across disciplines. And it has nothing to do with men being more present in academia, even controlling by the numbers of earned PhDs, using these econometric models in which you can count number of years after the earning of the PhDs and the position in the international rankings of the journals. Women are still less cited, significantly less cited than men. Secondly, women have been excluded from inquiry. Some or several studies have been run without distinguishing, without disaggregating the data for men and women under the assumption that there's this universal individual that might speak for all interests, needs, expectations, right? And this might happen not to be true. Thirdly, producing theories of women that represent them as inferior or deviant, and this builds on the second point. So if we have one reference model, and this reference model tends to be predominantly men, any result that differs from this pattern is likely to be read as there's something wrong with that. So women might deviate instead of might have a different position in society or different preferences due to several factors that mainstream research tends to ignore. Also, we see that theories of social phenomena have rendered women's activities and interests invisible. And this speaks of the gender history of the discipline. And when I say discipline, and that was in my title for the presentation, I speak of any discipline. Every discipline has a particular gender history of what core concepts, what core epistemic approaches have been used that make some topics or that run some topics of second order importance. And I think this is still the case with gender studies. I've discussed this with several colleagues, and we have common experiences. We often experience this lack of academic response by some colleagues. I've done research on gender quotas, for example, and had this conversation with Ruud Dagleroep, is a professor emeritus now, and she remembers very well having presented on different occasions papers on gender quotas as an electoral reform with a crucial impact on who is in institutions and what is the impact of descriptive representation over substantive representation, so how MPs are likely to act. And she explains that it is quite often for her to have these predominantly male colleagues asking her questions about or giving their opinions on why they dislike quotas, why they oppose quotas. But this has nothing to do with the paper, which was about the electoral consequences of the introduction of quotas or the policy-making process that led to the quota adoption. So this still occurs. Also, theories of social phenomena that do not include gender-power relations, so they might not have the capacity to challenge how society is structured. So at the end, social science is science about society, but also for society. So this is a key part of this knowledge, these dominant knowledge practices. So why does it happen? Basically, we can use this saying that goes, you cannot understand someone's experience until you have walked a mile on their shoes, and shoes are not one size fits all. This applies to programs and services, and it applies to research as well, right? So this is the definition that the European Institute for Gender Equality, EIGE, provides on its thesaurus. So gender blindness is the failure to recognize that the roles, responsibilities of women and men are ascribed to, imposed upon in specific social, cultural, economic, and political contexts. So these gender blind projects, and I insist, including research, do not take into account these different roles and needs, and as a consequence, they will maintain the status quo. They will not transform the unequal structure of gender relations. And this is precisely how the European Union is emphasizing the need for mainstreaming gender into research. Yes, it is a matter of social justice. Yes, it is a matter of correcting these historical inequalities and discrimination, but it's also a matter of research quality and societal relevance of knowledge and the knowledge transfer, right? So it's also a call for action. So all researchers, regardless of the topic that they examine, should acquire this adequate knowledge on the gender dimension, both in general and in their specific fields of research. And this is useful for a variety of reasons. First, it's going to help you, or it's going to help us, question the gender norms and stereotypes, to rethink the standards and reference models that we have taken for granted in past research. It also leads to a better in-depth understanding of citizens' needs, behaviors, and attitudes. And this is especially so because by adopting this perspective, we will avoid, on the one hand, essentializing gender. So considering that all men and all women have exactly the same interests, ideas, expectations, etc., but also it's going to help us avoid overgeneralizations. So having this reference model that can be a reference for any single individual in society, which we know it is not true. And there are also significant differences between groups of men and groups of women. And although I don't have time to develop this concept here, I presume you have heard about the intersectionality concept, right? And maybe in the next discussions, you'll be deepening to it. So how to do it? There's also plenty of resources to use. Some of them are quite, so they have over 10, 15 years. Some of them are more recent. I encourage you to use these resources and also to participate in the training sessions that your universities might offer, and how to integrate gender in research. Also, how to mainstream gender into teaching. At the end, it's the same competence. It's if you acquire this competency, you can apply it to all areas of your academic activity. And finally, the gender perspective is part of the feminist project, but the feminist project or feminist research goes beyond integrating gender into research, right? I decided to choose one premise and some key questions. Of course, there are others, but I think one premise feminist researchers might share is that it is difficult to think of an aspect of politics, economy, society, you name it, that is unaffected by gender. And indeed, I would even challenge you, I mean, in a positive way, to come up with a sphere in which you consider that gender does not apply, and then raise the question during the different presentations, and you might get to realize that it does have some impact. Key questions addressed by feminist research are the following. What are the implications of taking gender seriously in social sciences? So it goes beyond adding the variable sex in your models. That might be needed, but a step forward is also needed. How can a gender approach contribute to our understanding of the topics under examination? So sometimes we include women into the analysis and the questions do not work anymore, because these questions had been premised on the idea that they operated equally regardless of the sex and gender identity of individuals. And finally, how does a gender-sensitive perspective change the way we think about and analyze such topics? How I'm doing with time? Do I still have a couple of minutes? Yeah. Yes, sure. So my last slide would like to highlight which are the main contributions of the feminist research. And I appreciate a lot the work that the specialized journals are doing in this regard, the 3 journals that are invited in this conference, and other journals as well from different disciplines. The feminist research is broadening the scope of the discipline. This research has been very helpful in identifying that the boundaries of any discipline have been shaped by gender. Gender norms that are pervasive in society also infiltrate the academia and our ideas of what science is, who has more epistemic authority, which concepts are central, which are the topics that are going to be covered or not. And you can check it with a scanning of handbooks, which are these repositories of knowledge, and you will find gender nowhere. And this is worrisome. We need to revise critically what we are reproducing as knowledge without critically examining the gender history of the disciplines. Another key contribution has been challenging the epistemological boundaries and transforming the analytical frameworks. As I was saying, finding women or finding gender in our analysis has allowed to establish new questions, to obtain new results, and this specialized literature, as I also said before, is useful for everyone, regardless of the research you do, because it's filling the gaps that the discipline or the different sub-disciplines have. So these are going to be, or these are very useful articles to help you see gender. Sometimes gender it's not seen straightforwardly, but you can be trained to see gender, I insist, beyond the variable sex. Third, addressing critical gender omissions that distort accounts of the political world, the economic world, the communications world, etc. And this is why the EU is emphasizing here the research quality, the research performance. If relevant gender issues are missed or poorly addressed, then results are likely to be partial and potentially biased. The research is likely to be flawed. So it's about the quality of research. Another contribution of feminist research is documenting the operation of gender power relations in institutions. Institutions understood very broadly: political, economic, social, media institutions. And one key point is engaging with social change. I insist, many of you might share this perspective, but this is in the DNA of feminist research. Social research is, social science is science about society, but also for society. And feminist research has an implicit agenda that seeks to transform society by identifying the causes of inequality, the consequences of inequality, and by being in a better position to address those inequalities by identifying policy recommendations, etc. So, good feminist science, it's just good science. I encourage you to not just mainstream gender into your research, but also get acquainted with the feminist science literature, which has produced several contributions to all the disciplines. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for this, I think, inspiring introduction to concepts like inequality, social justice, change, discrimination, and so on. I think it's been a really good introduction into the feminist research and these main contributions of feminist issues. So thank you very much again. Thanks, Tanya. So now it's the turn for Cynthia Carter, excuse me. I changed the Cynthia Carter. She's the editor of Feminist Media Studies, and she will present reflections on an evolution in media research, editing, and publishing. Yeah. So I'll make a short introduction to our colleague Cynthia. She's a reader in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture in the University of Cardiff in the United Kingdom, and she has published several works on children, news and citizenship, feminist news, and studies of journalism and violence in media. And her most recent books are Journalism, Gender and Power, and Routledge Companion to Media and Gender, Current Perspectives in Feminist Media Studies. She's the founder and co-editor of, as I said, Feminist Media Studies. So, Cindy, your turn. You have 15 to 20. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Just trying to work out the technical. Thank you very much to the wonderful organizing committee, including Frederick and his colleagues who invited Okay, sorry about that. I'd just like to thank everyone who was behind the invitation to this event today. I'm very excited by the invitation for an opportunity to speak about feminist media research and more specifically about the journal, which I was just thinking about how long I've been associated with it, several years before it first started publishing in 2001, so it's been 20 years. So yeah, a very long time, but it's been a wonderful ride. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the journal and I think why it came about and why a publication like Feminist Media Studies is still needed today. If I can. Okay, so as I just mentioned, it was launched in 2001, but the idea for the journal was percolating for quite a long time. My founding co-editor, Lisa McLaughlin, was actually the person who got the ball rolling with Routledge in the late 1990s, and they were convinced that it would be a very good idea to find a home for feminist media research that was being published here, there, and everywhere, but having a home where feminist scholars could know that their work would be taken seriously and reach out to that broad community of scholars doing research of this kind. But not only scholarship, but also bringing together the voices of feminist activism as well. So as Tanya was saying, that feminism has always been a political project as well as a scholarly one, so it's creating those spaces for that kind of dialogue between scholarship and activism as well. So the commissioning editor back in the late 1990s, Rebecca Barden, was actually one of the best champions for this journal, because at a time when the feminist research actually was still fairly marginalized within the discipline, she nonetheless saw a gap in the market, and also that there was excellent work being done that could be brought together in this one place. Support was definitely needed for this kind of scholarship, which was being regarded still at that point as somewhat marginal to the mainstream of research, and thus scholars' careers. So it was a question of legitimacy. So the journal was bringing a legitimacy, an institutional and epistemological legitimacy to feminist research. I mean, this was at a time when people would say, I'm not a feminist, but, or oh, that's the F word, we can't say that word. Now, the journal in the early days struggled with a range of issues. One was around actually getting submissions at first, which was a bit surprising given all of this research was being done, but it takes a while for a publication to become known and also be seen as a safe place to publish, because it might not, your boss might say, well, you don't want to publish in that journal because it's not prestigious enough. So we did have to kind of reach out quite a lot and encourage people to submit at first. It's not a problem we have now, but in the early days it was. Also, for ourselves, there wasn't that much by way of institutional support in terms of helping us with actually processing papers, and we had to do a fair amount of kind of our own marketing as well. So that was an issue at first. Also, we struggled until 2017 to actually get indexing recognition with what used to be known as Thomson Reuters ISI, I think it's SSCI now. So impact factor was always something we struggled with, because we would have scholars say, I would love to publish in your journal, but it's not recognized by Thomson Reuters, so my institution won't let me publish in your journal. So so that's been an issue. And just the wider marginalization of feminist research, especially in the early days. Why do we still need, 20 years later, why do we still need feminist media studies journals or feminist journals or gender studies journals? Well, as I mentioned at the outset, feminism isn't just about scholarship. It's a political theory and a movement for gender justice, and that is an ongoing thing. And I've been around long enough teaching at Cardiff since the early 1990s to see feminism go, well, it was down here when I started, and then it kind of went up, and then it went down again. But it was always kind of not going down as low as it used to be. So we're experiencing, I think, a fairly high point at the moment. It's very encouraging, but we still need that space because they provide a kind of safe and space, which is also dynamic and dialogic for scholarship and activism. And that's something we've always tried to do with the journal and now with, we have a social media editor. We're trying to do even more of that, of creating that space for dialogue between activism and scholarship. What kind of manuscripts do we get? Do we have any priorities? Do we exclude anything? At the moment, we seem to be getting a lot on all kinds of social media issues. A lot around sexual violence, which is really quite encouraging because in the early days we had a fair amount and then it kind of dropped off, and now there's a sort of renewed push to look at these issues. And also gender and sexual identities. And that's been a feature all along, is looking at a range of different media and looking at those issues. Our priorities are always around critical research, intersectional research increasingly. We get a lot of papers that are adopting that kind of stance, and we really do encourage that. Any kind of orientation, theoretical or methodological, is absolutely fine as long as it's critical in orientation. And nothing is excluded. We have quantitative and qualitative research, film, social media, television, books, comics. It just runs a very wide array of topics. Has there been any homogenization? And this is an issue that, in the field, this is an issue which concerns a lot of scholars and journal editors. We've always invited critically informed, feminist and gender-sensitive research on any topic using any methods, emphasizing right from the start as well that it's a journal which has an international scope, looking for transnational research, global interest, to see how what we do, what we're looking at has implications, not just sort of locally, but also globally. Any worrying trends? I think impact factors still is an issue because even though we now have this, SSCI, it can have the effect of skewing research because it makes scholars sometimes a little bit too, go for the safe option and maybe dilute what they're saying in order to do what they think is going to allow them to get into that journal. And that can have a kind of conservatizing, is that a word, effect also on the journal as well as the scholarship. So that continues to be a concern. Also things like research ranking of scholars and journals, I think in general, can have that kind of conservatizing effect possibly. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. Have trends towards homogenization influenced the development? I should say these are some questions I was asked to respond to, so I've tried to kind of shape my talk in that sort of vein. Have any trends toward homogenization influenced the development of the field? How has the field evolved? Well, I think, as it's matured and, feminist research, gender-sensitive research, and become more accepted in the academy, it's inevitable, I guess, that certain norms are established, and that's coupled with certain tendencies toward trends in topics. So you get, in the early days, every second paper seemed to be on Sex in the City, because everyone was interested in that, and gender and sexual identities. And at one point, Lisa and I said, if we get one more paper on Sex in the City, we're going to scream and say no, even if it's a good paper. It's just. So, and as journals become more successful, there is a concern that they might be overly influencing the field as well, people kind of second guessing what the good topics are and again what's going to get them into the journal. So also what counts as legitimate research, and I do worry about that with feminist media studies at times, and that's why with the social media editor now we're trying to kind of shake things up a little bit and broaden its scope, because within the confines of a journal itself it can have that kind of dampening effect on creativity and openness. And also I continue to be concerned about the articulation between feminist theory and activism. It's always been an issue, and that's why we've always tried to create a space for that kind of dialogue between feminist activism and theory. Scientific and social impact. Feminist gender theories are informing a wide range of socio-political issues. How could feminist gender and communication journals contribute to this discussion? Well, I think for me it's around encouraging a cross-disciplinary dialogue. And what's interesting in feminist media studies is we seem to have achieved that. There seems to be, we have scholars from political science, from English, from cinema studies, from sociology, wide, health studies. So there is that kind of cross-disciplinary dialogue with the focus on media and culture and communication. As I already mentioned, opening up digital spaces, I think, via the social media provision with the journal will help facilitate that scholarly dialogue, and maybe also help us to think of new ways of getting our research into the hands of policymakers and lawmakers, so that it's not just academics and activists speaking to one another, but making concrete changes. Any issues, approaches, methodologies missing? Well, I would say, and what kind of research would we like to receive? I think there's not enough, we don't receive enough from certain parts of the world. We're doing quite well in Europe, across Europe now, including in Spain, I should be happy to say. But there's certain areas of the world, South America is, we don't get very much from there, or African countries. So I'd like to see more of that, more intersectional feminist research, more non-fictional media, because we get a lot of fictional entertainment media. Research around masculinities, which I think is crucial, but we get a fair amount, but we could have a lot more. And perhaps a wider array of methods, including more audience research, policy studies, cross-cultural, grassroots communication, action research, that sort of thing. And I think this is finally, oh, maybe not. How am I for time? 2 minutes? Yeah. Right, okay. Current challenges, increases in the volume of submissions. I look like I do because we're getting so many submissions now, and I think it might be partly down to the SSCI, which we have wanted because we wanted that legitimacy, and now perhaps I'm ruining the day, but we get a lot now, and it's a lot of work. We also increased from 3 issues in 2001, and we're now doing 8 as of per year. And increased expectations to market the journal across social media. So the Routledge does a lot of this, but editors are also asked to kind of do a fair amount of that increasingly. Levels of institutional support can still be, for some journals, quite low. Are you getting the help? Is what you're doing being recognized in workloads? A commitment to feminist political and scholarly aims. Currency and relevance, so when feminism goes in and out of fashion, that remains a challenge. How not to preach to the converted. We are talking to one another, but how do we get our work out to others who aren't necessarily sympathetic or just know what we do? And also to insist on the relevance of activism, feminist activism across polity, politics, society. Oh, hang on. Oh, that was the final slide. Got behind myself, so that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cindy. It's been a we'll have the opportunity to talk about all these
Yeah,
issues
okay.
in the round table. So thank you very much. And now it's
Should I sort
yeah.
of? Yeah.
no.
Okay.
So now it's the turn for Krista Brumley. She's the co-editor of Gender and Society, and she will present the vital importance of gender studies. Krista Brumley is an associate professor of sociology at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. Her research interests focus on gender, the work-family nexus, and work organizations in the United States and Mexico. She has published on these topics in Gender and Society, Gender, Work and Organizations, Sociological Inquirer, Journal of Family Issues, and so on. So, Krista, it's your turn. Thank you very much.
Good morning. This is not on, right? Can everybody hear me? Yes. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you also. I'd like to echo for the invitation to fly for less than 48 hours to Barcelona. I'm very relieved. I've been here a few times, so I've seen many of the sites in the city, but it's going to be a whirlwind tour between today and leaving tomorrow. But again, thank you very much. I'm one of the 4 deputy editors for the journal Gender and Society. And so I'm going to actually pick up where Tanya left off a little bit. I think our talks parallel quite well. I'm a sociologist, so the only way I can think about the world is through the lens of sociology and as a feminist sociologist. And so what I'm going to do is situate the talk about the journal within larger sociological issues that we're seeing of gender and what I'm calling very challenging yet exciting times to be studying gender. And then I'm going to talk about why I'm saying they're challenging and exciting, because there's been a real backlash. And then throughout the talk, I'm going to situate the journal in some of these issues. And then towards the end, I will do something very similar to what Cindy did in terms of talking about what we're looking for in the journal, where it's going, some of the trends in the research, and many of the challenges that Cindy outlined, we are also having as well. And so for me, when I think about what I'm calling this challenging and exciting time to be studying gender, the US, like many other places in the world, have undergone really dramatic sociocultural, economic, political contexts. They've changed substantially. Gender, the way we think about gender and sex is being disrupted. It's not the same as it was a few decades ago, or even 2 or 3 decades ago. It's changed. And so as a result of that, there is a significant ideological opposition to the shifting ways we think about gender and sex. And as a result, we're seeing a pushback on gender studies programs and challenges in general to gender scholarship, right? So it's important what journals do in terms of the production of knowledge and the production of gendered knowledge. But because of this tension of changing environments, there's been a lot of pushback. So I have some data to show. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I don't typically like numbers, but I was really excited when Tanya put up the slide about the academy, because if she had swapped out what that looked like for the United States, it would have been identical. So as you move up into the academy, it gets whiter and maler in the case of the United States. So those percentages are actually pretty similar to what we see in the United States across all disciplines. So even the social sciences, we see that as well. So I'm a work scholar. So I wanted to start today to talk about when we think about these broad changes in society and then what that means for the journal. And so if we think about the changes in the public spaces, in the paid labor market, this data is from looking at 75 to 2017. There's been dramatic changes of women in the labor market, in the paid labor market. And what's particularly interesting is mothers in the paid labor market. So mothers are going in, the women are going into the paid labor market, they're becoming mothers, and they're staying in the paid labor market. So the highest percentage for women in the paid labor market is actually mothers with children under the age of 6, which means they're not in what we refer to as kindergarten, right, or pre-K. Their children are quite young. at the same time, so while we're seeing these major shifts, it doesn't mean that women are necessarily in leadership positions. We're still seeing a vast inequality in terms of leadership positions. But in the private space, gender is changing as well. And so if we look at what's happening in the home, this is average hours weekly. Again, this is US data. You can see from 1975, that's the first set of columns here, to the second set of columns is 2014 data. What it shows is that there's real imbalances between what men and women are doing at home, right? And so even though the gap has closed a little bit, the gap has only closed marginally. And so often critics of gender, of looking at these numbers and what this means, will say, well, that's because this just includes all women. And many women don't work, right? And so of course they're doing more in the household. And so my response to that is, well, not really. So this is dual income parents. So in these statistics, it's dual income families where both the mom and the dad are working full time. And so again, if we look at the 1970s, there was a gap between fathers spending 9 hours and mothers spending 16 hours. And the gap has decreased 7 to 12 hours. That's a good move for the gap, but there's still a pretty significant gap. And so while we've had these changes over the past several decades in this public and private sphere, what are scholars doing? How are we thinking about explaining what these differences are? And then this is where I want to talk a little bit about what the journal's history's been and the ways that we look at trying to explain these gendered inequalities. So I know my audience is really diverse, so I don't want to spend too much time going through some of these earlier explanations, but I wanted to just say, so, early on we explained these gender differences because it was biological, and Tanya had this on one of her slides as well. And so the reason that there are differences between what men and women do is because it's biology. It's innate, and that's just the way it is. And then in the 1950s, the school of functionalism became very popular in the United States, and from that became sex roles. So men and women do things differently because it's necessary for stability in social society. So if we don't have stability in social society, then it's going to, there'll be unevenness and insecurity about what men and women are supposed to be doing. But the problem with this particular viewpoint is that it's static across time and space, and it doesn't take into account any power or privilege dimensions. One of the roles of the journal in thinking about this is pushing back on sex roles. So we think about it much differently than that it's necessary that men and women do different things for social stability. Right about the same time, you had socialization. So boys and girls do things different because they're trained really early on to do things different, and then they carry that into adulthood, and so that's why they do different. They study different kinds of majors in college. They go into different kinds of occupations. With the feminist movement in the 1970s and into the 1980s, there was a real pushback on both of these ways of thinking. And so you have the structuralists and the interactionists, and we think of gender as something that's socially constructed. And this is the foundation of the journal and the way we think about gender and gender processes. Gender is derived from both structure and cultural spaces, and trying to understand what that means. And then, of course, in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and Cindy talked about this as well, the interactional perspective. And so in the journal, we are definitely looking for articles that talk about intersection, but it doesn't have to be that way. But there has been an increasing interest in thinking about this. And of course, this comes from, in the 1980s, Black feminist thought, pushing back on white feminism in the US, and then on Western perspectives as well. And so when I think about these tensions of the difficulties of publishing and the relationship of the larger society and what it means to be a gender scholar and what it means to publish research, there's been a lot of backlash. And I would argue that much of this is because there's been an erosion of a really clear idea of a gender binary, right? So if it's no longer necessary for social stability, what does that mean? And that makes people very uncomfortable, except for probably most of the people in this room, right? Because as academics, we think about this all the time. But we want our research to go beyond academics. We want to preach to more than those people that we talk to all the time. So you have this relationship with these continued debates on who should work, when should they work, intensive motherhood, but trying to make fatherhood visible. In the case of the United States, I think most of you probably know, we are the worst country in terms of having work-family policies. We don't have any at all. It's to the benevolence of the corporations and what they're willing to give you. We've had a lot of public debates on transgender adults and children in the United States. This came out very clear about a year ago in what they called the bathroom wars. I don't know if you heard about this, but trying to figure out what to do in particularly elementary schools to have when there are transgender children in the schools and how to handle that. Much of this, of course, is clouded by our current political environment. And then there's been public policy rollbacks, significant rollbacks for women, particularly on reproductive rights. And at least in the case of the United States, our current Supreme Court leaves many of us quite concerned about where that's going to go. And so as a result, it's very challenging to publish gender research. And I think it's becoming more and more challenging for the journal, in part because of social media. We're encouraged as editors to get the knowledge out there and to get it out to as broad of an audience that's possible. But what it means is there's a lot of pushback. And so university context, I know there was the one case in Hungary, they were going to disband the gender studies program. In the case of the United States, gender studies programs are woefully underfunded, and the first things that get cut are always the social sciences and the humanities. STEM does much better for many reasons. But there's been cutbacks dramatically. In the case of my university, we have a program that's barely even recognized. It's unfortunate at a time when it's so essential to have gender research out there. There's also been an issue of publishing on what we call hoax papers. And I don't know how many of you know about this. There's been a couple cases where data's been made up and has been submitted to journals, and sometimes it makes it through the peer review process, and it's been published, and then the authors will come out and say, well, that data really wasn't true, we lied about that. So that happened to Gender and Society. I am very pleased to be able to say that our peer review process works. And so there were 2 manuscripts that were submitted. One was desk rejected, which means that it comes in, within a couple weeks we take a look at it, it's not a good fit for the journal, and then we write a letter to the author saying we're not going to send it out for review. The other one actually went all the way through the peer review process, and the assumption was that it maybe was a very young scholar or a graduate student who needed a lot of mentoring. And one of the missions of the journal is to mentor scholars. And so the authors received like 10, 12 pages of reviews on their article, but it was rejected. All the reviewers said this needed to be rejected. Well, after the authors got the rejection, they came out and said, yeah, that data really wasn't true. All right? And so it becomes very complicated to trying to illuminate what gender distinctions there are, why it's important to understand gender, and the processes of it when you're having this kind of pushback. So the mission of our journal has remained consistent from the 1980s when it was started, and it's always been to publish articles that analyze gender and gendered processes. And we look at, it can be gender processes in terms of interactions, organizations, societies, and global and transnational spaces. The trends of the journal within that broad mission statement, they have 2 columns here. So the one which will be on your left are still very common topics in terms of gender, and these themes keep coming up. So work and families, marriage, intimacy, motherhood, fatherhood, reproduction, masculinities, and sports. These are all classic areas in sociology that we look at. What's really exciting are the newer trends of where we're getting a lot of gender research. So in particular, we've had an upswing of manuscript submissions that look at transgender and non-binary, which is really exciting. So if you look at some of the issues, you'll notice that in the past couple of years, there's been substantial more. Looking at sexualities, and there has been a focus under this editorship and then the previous one to go beyond the United States, because there are, several other countries in the world than just the United States. So taking a much more global, transnational perspective. There's also been a lot more on violence, abuse, and rape. And so the very first year that we took over in 2015, the special edition focused on sexual assault and rape, on bodies, embodiment, and health. And then the February issue is another special issue, and it's on disability. So while intersectionality is important, and often when we think about intersectionality research, we're thinking about race, class, and gender. Well, this particular special issue brings in a disability into the conversation as well. And then there's also been an upswing of articles on religion, which I see as a reflection of where we are in society now, given some of the tensions, particularly, again, in the case of the United States, religious tensions, but of course elsewhere in the world, of interest in trying to understand what that means and what does that mean for men and women in different kinds of ways. And we have some art in media. We don't have a lot. I would say that is probably one of our biggest, what's being excluded. So it's not that it's being excluded intentionally, we're just not getting the manuscript submissions to really look at this particular area. The journal's interdisciplinary, so we have authors that are from all kinds of disciplines, but by and large, they still remain sociologists. But we have political scientists that have published in the journal. We have a couple communication scholars that have social work, nursing. What am I leaving out? I think that's probably psychologists as well. But again, it still predominantly remains sociologists. As I mentioned, we're trying to be more global and transnational. So this data is just data on the past year. And so you can see, again, most of our manuscripts are still focused on the United States, but I'm pleased as an international scholar, it's been really important for me in working with the editor to try to get as many other manuscripts in the journal as possible that looks at something other than my country. So India, Cambodia, Canada, China, Democratic Republic of Congo, Israel, Kenya, Korea, Mexico, Norway, and Russia are just some are the examples of what we've done just in the past year. So I will encourage authors to do research outside the United States to submit to the journal. We are not looking just for US data. I want to actually, well, no, I'll stay here. I was going to come back to this at the very end. How am I doing on time?
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of the nuts and bolts of the journal itself, our manuscripts are empirical articles in that they're theoretically engaged. They're to be methodologically rigorous, and we do publish qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies. But I looked at the data where we are right now, 75% of our journal articles are qualitative. In part because we don't get quantitative manuscripts. And when we do get quantitative manuscripts, they often use gender as a variable rather than gender as a theoretical framework to explain what that data means. I don't know, Cindy, what your number of manuscripts are annually, but our heads are spinning. We are now at 500 annually, which is a lot. Right? That's more than one a day. So it doesn't seem like, that's just a little bit more than one a day. It's a lot of work to get through those manuscripts, to think about what goes out for review, what doesn't go out for review, and then trying to find scholars that are willing to go through the peer review process. Our acceptance rate is less than 10%. I know that sounds really daunting. In part, it's the nature of the beast of the academy and looking at impact factors. The journal right now is at 2.3, but a couple of years ago it was at 2.7, and a couple of years before that it was 2.1. It keeps fluctuating, and it depends on what ranking system you're using. More and more universities care about what ranks are of journals, and it matters for the tenure process. In the case of the United States, sometimes departments will say there is no precious journals list. But having earned tenure in the US, I will tell you, there actually is a precious journals list for the most part. And so you can have a more successful time in trying to become an associate professor or full professor if you're hitting publications in higher ranked journals. But one of the good things about the journal is our initial review rate is very fast. So we don't like to hold authors up because we understand how important it is for graduate students to get publications under their belt before they're going to hit the job market. We know how important it is for young scholars to be able to get promoted to associate and full. And so we make it a priority in the journal to do the peer review process as quickly as possible. So the total decision time from the day you submit to the day you find out if you earn a review and revise and resubmit is just under a year, which is not bad. Having published in multiple journals, I had one take 3 years, right, by the time it would get out. Things are much faster now because most journals are using online first. And so as soon as it's accepted, it goes through the copy editing process. It's on the website. So that has absolutely changed the nature of publishing. So I'd like to think that journals are not taking 3 years anymore to get things out into print. Our word count is 8,500, which is pretty comparable to other feminist journals. And then again, I had mentioned that we do have desk rejects, and we typically decide in 2 weeks, again, because we don't want to hold authors up, because it's important that those authors can then turn it around and send it to a more appropriate venue if necessary. All right, so what I want to do is go back to the theory that I was talking about in the beginning. This is what I think trips up authors the most in trying to get into the journal. It needs to make a theoretical contribution beyond an empirical contribution. And so you might have the most amazing data in the world that's really exciting data, but if you can't figure out what that theoretical contribution is, you're likely to not be successful in gender and society, right? It needs to be compatible with the journal's mission. And there is a homogenization of theory, but I would say not of topic. I mean, our topics are quite varied, as you saw by that previous slide, but I would definitely say the theory is a smaller set of theories that we can use. And then related to that is there's a core set of sociological gendered theories that manuscripts over and over cite. And so many of these probably are familiar to those of you in the audience that are gendered scholars. So Weston Zimmerman, right? So Weston Zimmerman, 1987, doing gender. I can't recite the volume and the number or the page number, but that is one of our core theoretical pieces. Following up from that, of course, there's doing difference, there's undoing gender, and then there's a body of research on hegemonic and multiple masculinities. So this is Connell and Messerschmitt's work. And then gendered organizations. I mean, that goes back to 1990, and that's Joan Acker's work. And so these theoretical foundational pieces are absolutely key, but it's not going to be enough to be successful in the journal. And so one of the first things that I do as a deputy editor when a manuscript comes in, so manuscripts come into the editor, and then she divvies them up under the four of us. She takes some, and then she divvies them up to the rest of us. I always look at the reference list. It's the very first thing that I do. And I'm not going to not send it out because gender and society hasn't been cited, but it gives me a pretty good idea if the author understands what the conversation is and the conversation they should be having with the scholars in the journal. And it is absolutely essential to figure out how to situate your research in whatever the ongoing conversation is in the journal. And there are multiple conversations going on in the journal, but you have to figure out who are the scholars you want to talk to, right? If you could pick and choose who the people are you want to go to lunch with, right? Who would those scholars be? And those are the scholars that you're talking to, and you have to engage with their work. And I know it seems very elementary to say, you need to read the journal, but I'm consistently surprised at the number of manuscripts that come in that they say, well, I focus on women, or, it does talk about gender, but haven't figured out what their in is and what entry point they're going to make a difference in the conversation. Often we get questions about, well, my paper only pertains to one country. Does that matter? it doesn't matter at all. In fact, a qualitative research is probably not going to look much beyond a very small, very specific group. So that doesn't matter. What does matter is figuring out how to bump it out so that a broader audience could understand it. So when I think about, like my own research has been on gender and work in Mexico, that's fantastic. I need to be able to speak to the Mexicanists, the Mexican scholars. I need to be able to explain how gender and work is happening in Mexico. But if I can't figure out how to take that to the next level so that somebody who does gender and work in Spain, or somebody who does gender and work in Russia, or somebody who does gender and work in the United States, if they can't see the relevance for my research in a much broader context, then that's going to be problematic. And so it doesn't matter if it's just one country or just a small group. Just figure out how to talk to a broader audience. And again, right, expand the gender theory, make an original contribution. I get a lot of comments or questions that say, what does that mean exactly? And I think it's about the framing of your paper and figuring out how to talk about it in a way that allows for the editors and for the peer reviewers to see, oh, they understand what that theoretical frame is that best explains their data, and they're trying to build on it or push beyond that. Again, we have very few communication scholars. Maybe after this conference, we will have more communication scholars submitting to the journal. It's okay to be very interdisciplinary in your theory. That's not a problem for the journal. All right, so then some other suggestions that often come up. Joe Rieger is the editor of the journal, and we will get emails often about the journal, which is absolutely fine if it's going to be to ask about the status of the manuscript. But we have, if somebody's going to email us and ask if it's appropriate, that's probably not a good thing to do, right? So again, it goes back to thinking about where your research fits into the journal. And really understanding, this is particularly important for younger scholars, and I know I've been there, trying to figure out how to take your dissertation and your thesis and actually turn it into an 8,500 word manuscript is daunting. And it's different, right? You frame it differently, you talk about the literature differently. For those of you who are maybe writing your dissertation or thesis, or you still remember when you were writing your dissertation or your thesis, it's like everything but the kitchen sink, right? Because your committee wants you to be able to demonstrate that you can talk about lots of different stuff in many different ways, but not so in a journal article, and it's difficult to do that. I remember the first paper I published, it was 14,000 words, and the editor came back and she's like, yeah, you need to get rid of 5,000 words. I was like, I can't get rid of 5,000 words. All those words are really important, right? I got rid of 5,000 words. It took me a while, but I got rid of them. We have a new blind peer review policy. And this has been, journals have been going back and forth about how to do this. So it used to be where you would just leave your self-citations out, and then maybe you would write a letter to the editor and say, self-citations will be put in on X pages. Now what Gender and Society does, and what increasingly the sociology journals are doing in the US, is you cite yourself. Because if you don't cite yourself, then somebody's going to say, why didn't you cite that person? You should have known to cite that person. So I don't know what communication journals are doing now, but this is a recurring trend in the sociology journals. Challenging decisions. This is a really difficult one, and Sarah and I were talking about this last night. What happens when you get rejections? It's tough. It's tough. I mean, I still have battle scars. I keep saying I'm going to print them out and put them on my wall in the office, so when the graduate students come in, I can say, look at all these rejections I got. But just to think about it this way, the more you send out papers, the more you're being rejected, it really just means the more you're actually doing scholarship, and papers will be published. So one good review does not necessarily mean a manuscript is publishable, and this is really difficult for journals. So we are asking scholars to take unpaid time out of their day to write reviews that is probably not recognized work, because it's service work, and service work is not valued work, And service work is not going to get you to associate, and it's not going to get you to full professor, and it's not going to get you the job. So we're asking people to take time out and do something. Sometimes we'll get reviews back, and there'll be 3 reviews, and 2 of them, as a scholar, you're looking and you're thinking, they seem very positive. Only 1 review was really critical. What often we don't realize is that there are editors there are comments, there's a box on the website when you're in Manuscript 1 or Scholar 1 is what I think it's called now, where a peer reviewer can submit private comments to the journal. And so often those comments to the editor take a much harsher perspective than what the reviewer did for the actual public review. And in part, it's because we want constructive feedback to go to scholars. We don't want the review to go out and says, you actually didn't understand your data. That's quote for quote on a review that I got one time. You don't know your data and you don't understand your data. Well, that's not very helpful for me, right? What we want is constructive feedback. And so when we're making decisions about whether or not it's a revise and resubmit, if it's a rejection, is it a conditional accept, is it a second revise and resubmit, these are all the things we're taking into account. What the peer reviewers might have said to the authors about the manuscript itself. So publishing in English when it's not your native language, this is tough. I've published in Spanish. I'm a terrible Spanish writer. I learned to speak Spanish. I always tell my colleagues on the streets, I just figured out how to do it. But I can't write to save my life in Spanish. So I write it in English, and then I usually have somebody translate it for me. And then we go do that back and forth to make sure that the translation actually captures what I want in English. I'm not suggesting that second language speakers do it that way at all, but if you're writing in English and it's not your native language and you have some concern that it could cloud the peer reviewers' ideas about your manuscript, you want them making a decision on the substance of the manuscript, not on some syntax because you didn't put the pronoun where the pronoun was supposed to be. We highly recommend that international scholars have somebody who reviews it for them. We do have a copy editor that will go through, but a copy editor doesn't get that manuscript until it's the very end, until it's been decided to be accepted. So I think that is quite important. But I would not let it discourage you from trying to make an attempt at sending a manuscript to Gender and Society at all. We have many scholars that have been published that English is not their native language, so we're definitely encouraging that. We're trying really hard to go beyond the very US-centric model of most US journals. It's tough. It's been a slow uphill battle for the journal, but we are trying to expand that, and hopefully with the next editorial team, they will keep on that particular trajectory. So the current editor and myself, we're done in a couple months, just so you know. There is an editorial transition, and so for those of you who've published or are beginning to publish, it's one of the things you might want to look at when journals are transitioning because you don't want to drop through the cracks. But if you have an article that you are thinking about sending to the journal, feel free to grab me at some point today, and I can walk you through some timing of how things are going to take place. If you're not ready to send us something as a full manuscript, we have a blog because it is 2019 and social media is really important. And so it's under, if you look under WordPress, if you Google Gender and Society blog, it should come up right away. And those are much shorter pieces, but it could get your feet wet a little bit for getting access to the journal, starting to work with the editorial team to see what it is that we're doing. And so we would welcome that as well. I think that is my last slide. So thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Krista, for this great and helpful presentation. And now it's turn for Sarah Riley. She's an associate editor of Feminism and Psychology, and she will present the practice, mission, an impact of feminism and psychology, keeping the vision in changing times. Sarah is a reader in critical psychology at the Aberystwyth University, UK, and lead for the Center for Critical Psychology there. Her research uses qualitative methods to explore the psychological impact of neoliberalism, addressing questions of gender, embodiment, health, youth culture, and citizenship. She has co-authored books including Post-Feminism and Health, and Post-Feminism and Body, and she's a current chair of the British Psychology Section, Qualitative Methods in Psychology. So Sarah, thank you very much for coming. Your turn.
Thank you for having me. Oh, and wait for my slides.
Yeah, that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, gracias. Hello, my name's Sarah. I'm on social media. So I'm at Sarah Riley Brown, if you want to stay in touch. I'm at Aberystwyth University in Wales at the moment. It's very wet and windy, so I'm so happy to be here. I'll be moving to New Zealand, so that's why I've got my Twitter up there. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the editor's vision over the years for feminism and psychology, who's currently being published in it and who's reading it, things that we don't publish, and then some of the challenges that we face. I think there's some overlapping and perhaps sometimes slightly different challenges. Homogenization, because Frederick asked us to talk about that, neoliberalism, open science, post-truth, and then gender issues. So I think it's interesting that that's my last problem on the list for a gender journal. So feminism and psychology, we would call it F&P, started in 1991, and it started by Sue Wilkinson with some other psychologists who all went on to make quite significant impact in British psychology and international psychology. They were really interested in challenging the mainstream, so challenging the male stream is a kind of pun in English, really concerned with psychology as distorting women's lives and psychology being quite distorting in understanding gender and women's experiences. So they wanted, that was their focus. And they were trying to do things differently. So I've put in there including writing conventions, so writing from the first person rather than in this more neutral, scientific, objectivist tone that psychologists prefer. In 2008, we have two new editors, Nicola Gavey and Ginny Brown. They were based in New Zealand, which represents some of the attempts for F&P to move beyond the UK. But we had editors still in the UK and the US. So you see a slight shift in the aims of the journal there. We're less on the outside of psychology. We want to be the first for feminist work in psychology, so we're being more focusing on ourselves and trying to find a place in psychology that doesn't mean we get incorporated into the mainstream, but that we are also standing kind of equal with it. The focus is on making a difference in women's lives, empirical theory and activism, and focusing on the specificities of disadvantage, discrimination, and oppression. And in the editorial, they talk about intersectionality explicitly for the first time there, and thinking about macro power issues and structural issues that impact on women. So that's a big issue for psychologists. We tend to focus on the individual. So drawing in this kind of sociological language was a standpoint as well. And in particular, trying to find a home for what people sometimes call big qual. So we're talking about qualitative research here that isn't an extension of objectivist science. So some authors have talked about small qual being the way that qualitative research can be used as an add-on. So you can do experimental work and qualitative work, trying to find objective scientific knowledge. The big qual tend to be coming from much more critical or phenomenological perspectives, seeing knowledge as produced in context. And F&P is very much keen on providing a home for, as we might call it, Big Quoll. Our most recent editor is South African-based Katarina McLeod, and our other editors are Rose, who's a daughter of Barcelona. She apologizes for not being here, but she sends her love, who's based in the UK, and Jean, who's based in the US. And the aim has been to really extend and reinterpret the aims of this journal, pushing a more global focus. So this has been a recurring theme, but has now become much more explicit, really focusing on how do we reach and engage better with people in less wealthy countries. Intersectionality is again described, and this time given a much more detailed discussion around trying to explore gendered realities along multiple and intersecting dimensions of difference, privilege, and inequalities, and their impact on people's lives, experiences, and dynamics of living. And a theme that was running through but has really been brought out more strongly is the idea that there are multiple feminisms and multiple psychologies and that we need to recognize and engage with. And for the first time, Indigenous psychology is named explicitly as an area that's welcomed and important for feminism and psychology. So some measures of success. The Americans like us, so we must be good. So the editors were delighted to, I'm just teasing Krista there, but we were absolutely delighted when the Women in Psychology of the American Psychology Association gave an award for distinguished leadership, and I've put it up in part to recognise the work of the editorial board, but for the kind of themes that F&P are pushing forward for encouraging, supporting and showcasing cutting edge and transformative feminist theory and research, for critical, radical and provocative feminist scholarship that has an impetus for social change, and for theoretical and methodological innovations, for clarifying the dynamics of oppression and discrimination and looking for new directions in theories, methods and practices. So that really kind of summed up the vision of F&P, and if your work is resonating with any of these things, then we'd be delighted to read it. Very briefly, our aims are now about really emphasizing the international element, fostering feminism theory and practice, really thinking about dimensions of difference, privilege and inequality, publishing a range of work, because different ways of communicating, I'm speaking to communications people here, obviously provide different ways of doing ideas and sharing ideas. So on in the purple there, you can see we have 800 words, articles that can be theoretical, empirical or methodological. We also have brief research reports. So if you've got something that's really kind of relatively small and tight and focused, but will hit our aims of our journal, then again, it's a bit like your blog, but a slightly more formalized process, I suppose, that you can go for a brief research report. We have commentaries. So one of my first engagements with F&P was a commentary. I was furious over an article that I'd read about body piercing, and I can't remember what feminist journal it was, but they were labeling it as self-harm, and so I typed a very angry feminist woman commentary about the problems of these kinds of arguments. So it allows debates to happen in this way. We have book reviews, we have special features, which might be on something topical, such as an interview with someone that we think is important, and we also run special issues in a collection of work on a groundbreaking topic that's new. And more recently, we've got a thing called a virtual special issue. And what that does is it gathers articles that have already been published in F&P on a theme, and we bring them together as a special issue online, drawn together with an overarching editorial commentary on the state of play for that issue. And I'll give you an example of that now. So, on this side, on your right, we've got, so this is two screenshots from the F&P site at the moment. So we have a virtual special issue on self-help, curated by the most wonderful Sarah Riley. So it's anyway advertising myself here. So what we did was we pulled together, over across about 12 years of work, there had been, every now and then, someone doing something really exciting on self-help, and we poured these articles together. So they're kind of resource if anyone's doing research on self-help. They're all put together on the website. And then we've written a kind of analytical editorial review about the state of play of how we see self-help. And we've done a few of these now. So this might be something if people are interested in, you've got a burning issue, like you want to bring the research together. We only showcase the research on feminism and psychology. But if you think, actually, I'm really interested in sexualization of culture, and there's been some really important contributions made by F&P, I could bring that together for a special issue for you. Then that might be something that, again, would be a way to participate in the journal. On this side, we've got perhaps a more standard special issue on the issue of abortion in this case. And you can see various different countries represented, part of our internationalism, including the UK, China and India, and I think South America there as well. You can also see that some of this is open access with the green lock, and others is through a paywall. And that's an issue that we're facing at the moment. So who gets published? People from the UK, from the States, from Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. So this is data coming from McLeod's editorial you can find online on our website in 2014. So you can see that it's English language speaking countries first. Scandinavian countries are the next ones down. Again, of course, English is very strong for them. And then other European countries. So that's a kind of a driver, I suppose, in terms of who's publishing for us that's relevant for you. In recent years, UK submissions have decreased in more recent data, which is troubling for us. It's good if we're getting increases. We've had a small increase from people in Europe outside the UK, but only of like less than 2%, where we've had quite a significant drop of UK submissions. And I think this might be part of the talk that we've been having about the nature of gendered research at the moment. We're both valued but devalued in certain circumstances, and again I'll talk about that in a minute. For those who are reading our work, site data on who's visiting the site is from the States, the UK, Canada, Australia. So we're getting quite a similar pattern of English-speaking wealthy countries, but then a shift. So then India, New Zealand, South Africa, Germany, Philippines, Sweden, these are our top 10 countries for site hits. So room for Spain, I think. This is a very busy slide, but just to give you a sense of what we're publishing. So the topic is here, the type of publication, data collection, and data analysis. And this is in order of publications. So in terms of topic, we've got theory, sexualities, parenting. I can let you work your way through that list. In terms of types of publication, empirical qualitative research is what we're publishing most. In types of data collection, interviews is what people are publishing in. And then so a little bit further down, there's media analysis, and online analysis as well. And then on the far side, in terms of data analysis, discourse analysis is the predominant method being published at the moment. So I don't know if the slides are available, but if people want to see that in more detail, I can always send it to them. So we don't do sex differences. Sue Wilkinson, the original editor, in her first editorial says, studies simply on women or reporting sex differences will not be acceptable unless they're set in a critical context. So we need to understand that gendered research that's looking at differences in between men and women. I don't know, when I did my PhD, if I read another article that told me that I couldn't park a car as well as man, I had really read enough of those, and I have a feeling that's the vibe. If you could contextualize my failure to park within some wider, interesting political dynamics, then we're prepared to hear it, but otherwise, it can go somewhere else. Research that doesn't recognize that knowledge is produced in context more generally is our big issue. So that would be qualitative work, what we might call small qual, that sees itself as producing objective knowledge, doesn't reflect on who the researcher is or the context that it's in, and quantitative work that isn't reflexive. So we are more than welcome for quantitative work, and it does get published a bit. So under the interviews one here, we can see that there's surveys, and I think there's some empirical quantitative works not too far down the list. But it has to have a reflexive element. It has to recognise that the researcher is coming from a particular area and working in a particular socioeconomic, etc. context. So when we were thinking about this slide, and I was talking to Rose about this presentation, she thought perhaps something that would be particularly important for you is the report style writing that's expected for SAGE journals in general. So there's an absence of literary style of writing. You know, we're very empirical, and even the theoretical work is very structured in a particular way. But if you look back at sort of seminal work in feminism and psychology, historically there was a much stronger literary style, and that's a style that I think has been stuck with in contemporary non-UK Europe. And so Rose was suggesting that this might be one of the exclusions that might be happening for people when they're trying to publish, say people from this university trying to publish in feminism and psychology, is that the expectations for how to write are a bit different. So thinking about challenges for our current editorial team, I'll just go through these quite quickly. There is this issue around acceptance criteria that I've mentioned, and there are some other issues that I'm going to talk through too. So if you think about this needing to write in a more scientific or report style structure, so probably the biggest impact for those not in English-speaking institutions is not writing in a literary style or having to convince us that that style is relevant and important. So there has been some experimentation with trying to pair people. So perhaps a more experienced person working in Europe with a more early career researcher in the UK, and then both could benefit in a kind of mutual learning process. But that hasn't been hugely successful. What's going on in a less systematic way has been some older academics, as they're coming up to retirement in the UK and the US, informally mentoring people through the process of writing up to kind of use their expertise. So that's something that we might try and develop in a more formalized way. Costs for you, of course, is in terms of proofreading, and that's time and money in terms of having to write in a second language. And another blockage that happens is that people pay for proofreading, but it's not good enough, or it's not the type of proofreading that you need to publish in a SAGE journal. So there's a slight change on the banner up at the top there. If you go onto feminism and psychology, you'll see that SAGE are advertising their own language services, and if you do have to pay for proofreading, we would recommend that you use the SAGE services. Perhaps another thing for thinking about homogenization is this move to try and to support objectivist research in our current climate. So Clark and Brown have written an article looking at feminism and psychology, and another journal, Psychology of Women Quarterly, and really making this case for how do we do feminist qualitative work, the big qual stuff, that's underpinned by a qualitative sensitivity, a theoretical sensitivity, and reflexivity, and how we can do that in the context of that I'm going to describe now. So that's one of our other challenges for trying to push against what feels like a bit of a homogenization of academic work in general. Oh, sorry. So it comes to my favorite. I am a scholar of neoliberalism. I'm actually at the stage now where I kind of hope it carries on, because otherwise I've lost my specialism. So I sit there with a political scientist going, is it still okay to talk about neoliberalism? So fortunately, we still live in a neoliberal society for my purposes, although not for many other joyful reasons. We have a marketization of our work and an expectation to be always productive and always producing in particular ways. So work that used to be done, I think Chris has mentioned this as well, that was done by goodwill, in terms of reviewing, is getting more limited because people just simply don't have the time. So it's harder for us to get reviewers, and sometimes we have to really search and ask and basically use personal favours to get people to read something. So quite often in my email I'll be like, I think you'll really enjoy this one, and sort of try and motivate people to do it. And so there have been some market solutions. So there's Poblenow, where you can get kind of ratings for doing review work. But it's a kind of market solution to a market problem. We've lost our collegiality and the ability to do this work as part of a kind of broader academic identity. Similarly, neoliberalism, with its very much focus on kind of individual performance and marketisation, makes it harder to do feminist collaborative work. So I had some work reviewed once. I was writing a proposal, and the peer reviewer that was supporting me said, none of the publications you've quoted is your first author. Well, why should we, the reviewers will wonder why they've got you and just not the other person that's first author. So there was myself and this other person doing collaborative feminist work, and we were being reviewed from a kind of it was very interesting to have that experience, because we were being reviewed in this very individualistic, competitive way. What's the point of having two of you when one will do? And Gill and Donoghue talk in quite depth about the problems trying to do feminist work in Neoliberal Academy, and I can send anyone that reference if you're interested. And finally, we have a national level assessment of our research, and the definitions of psychological research are very restricted, which really means that someone once said to me, if you publish in feminism psychology, that needs to be your hobby. So there's a kind of move for people publishing in one journal to meet the requirements of a very limited perspective of what is psychology, and then doing the work they actually want to do once they've got that done. So this might be the reason why we're having a decrease in UK submissions. So open science is an issue for everybody. Feminism and psychology, I think, is pretty good at the moment, in the sense that you can publish your article, the one that is going to be published. So some journals you have to publish one that starts right at the beginning of the process. So the one that you are actually going to be able to publish, but in your Word document, you can upload it on a repository, and then that makes it open access. So that has meant that basically you can do open access without having money, which is important for a lot of people. So there are concerns with Plan S. I don't know how familiar you guys are with this. Probably more than I am. I sort of really struggle when I read those documents, to be honest. But there's concerns that Plan S, which is meant to be making open science, the SAGE position, for example, is about that it's really only supports STEM research. Excuse me. We're concerned about exclusionary, how it will exclude sensitive qualitative work, because it wants to make data open access as well. But it's if you're doing hard to reach groups who are talking about sensitive issues, they might talk to you because you've done a lot of work to make those relationships feel safe. But they're not going to let just any old person read their personal stories. And this kind of drive for open data is not really paying attention to how it might reduce our ability to do research with sensitive and hard-to-reach groups. And of course, it's extremely exclusionary for people without significant funding. So you need not just funding to pay for open access, pay for, you need institutions that have got repositories that can do this kind of training and a range of things. So it does feel quite exclusionary and worrying, even though the drive is for, it's very much with a positive intent. So, post-truth, yay. So psychology itself has been hit by some real problems. We have what's called a replicability crisis. So people have been reproducing classic psychology studies and not finding the same findings. So if you're doing objectivist science, where one of the primary measures of whether your research is good is if it's replicable, we are very much in trouble. So there's been some huge debates within the quantitative world. And I thought, that's great, that's their problem, and I could just carry on doing my context-sensitive research. But the impact has been this drive for open science and this drive for sharing data to try and demonstrate, and have other people test the findings. There's also been some fake data scandals in psychology where people just made it up. And then, of course, the fake news issues, just more generally, has meant there's been a real, I think, cultural push for objective research that, again, has come from real positive intent. We're trying to do good work. But it's a real challenge if you're trying to do what we might call big qual work, contextualized, critical, phenomenological, informed work. In psychology, we also have this really interesting, and other disciplines too, but I'm just talking about what I know. It's a really interesting shift where I'm assuming we've borrowed it from the US, but the UK is just rolling out psychology programs across the world. In all sorts of countries, from Mauritius to Sri Lanka to China, and a very particular form of Anglo-American vision of what the human is like. So we have these kind of new forms of colonization happening, which again are kind of producing a very particular understanding of what it is to be a person that, from feminism psychology perspective, we're very worried about. So there's kind of dangers of homogeneity and for our big qual values to be ignored. And this real challenging this idea that it's harder and harder to challenge the idea that we are arbitrators of truth. And so I've just got two more. I'm between you and your coffee now, aren't I? So those are the big things that I guess are affecting us, that we are having to negotiate. What's more interesting from the point of view of gender research is gender issues. So I've got two slides for you. Concerns of the editorial board. So Cindy had a slide about Me Too. There's probably Me Too psychology out there. There's definitely been rumblings on Facebook where people are starting to disclose historical sexual harassment within the psychology community between supervisors and postgraduates, for example. And we're kind of wondering whether that's going to emerge more fully and publicly. The digital is obviously super important, and there are clear developments to come in terms of method and theory. We're very much encouraging an international focus and including researchers in a transnational context or researchers using decolonial theories. There's been, I think, a real emphasis to try and broaden our international focus, and we've been successful in certain fields. But in a way, I think we're kind of missing the Europeans. We've been kind of reaching out to in Africa and India, and even some attempts at South America, without seeing our friends closer at hand. So to very much welcome non-UK European contributions. We're really interested in how to manage or how to encourage good debates around pluralisms in feminism and psychology. So there are many feminisms, obviously. There's essentialist feminists, and there are constructionist feminists, and all sorts of feminists in between, who have very different perspectives on envisioning a better world. And equally, there's multiple psychologies, including indigenous psychologies, with similar challenging perspectives. And so our challenge is to animate these discussions, to bring these discussions to light, to value people's standpoints without just saying anything goes, but to have some in-depth and critical interpretations and discussions without an expectation to find an ultimate answer. And similarly, there's a lot of, intersectionality is quite a contested topic now in terms of what it actually means and how useful it is. So we recognise that it's really important, but again, it's a site for discussions, and we would like F&P to be one of those sites for those discussions. Excuse me. Clark and Braun, as I said, did a research evaluation on F&P and another journal that we came out pretty favourably. But two things they raised that I think are important are, if interviews are the most highly used method, is this a sign that we're not being innovative enough in feminist research? We need to think about more exploring our methods further. And they also found a really interesting trend where people were doing critical discursive work with white middle-class girls or women. And they were doing more phenomenological or experiential work where they were looking at the kind of lived experiences of more marginalized or vulnerable groups. And when each individual piece of work was fine and interesting in its own right, but when you put that pattern together, it looks like another form of kind of colonialism, really, where white middle class academic women can, thank you, white middle class women can be understood as critically using language, whereas marginalised women can only be given voice by other academics and only be understood as authentic in a slightly more simplified way. So there's a real question for us thinking about how we deal with that issue. Thank you. Clark and Brown argue that more reflexivity in all of these authors would be a useful standpoint. So that's us, really. I've talked a bit about our vision, who's getting published and reading it, mostly Anglo-American authors and readers, but there's been a clear agenda for change, and I think that's making a big difference. We have some kind of set of issues around neoliberalism, open science and post-truth that have some homogenization issues, and then we've got some kind of key gender issues within our very much a changing gender landscape that we also need to consider. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sarah. We're running short of time, so 10 minutes break, and after that, the round table. Okay, thank you.